This happened about 10 years ago. I'm just now posting this, because for the longest time I thought people wouldn't believe me. It was me and my two friends Noel and Cameron. We decided that it would be fun to go to a haunted house for the first time. At first, we had trouble finding where one was, since we lived in a small town. Within a few days, we actually found someone advertising how they had a haunted house, and they were passing out flyers to people while they were at the mall. The flyer itself just said something along the lines of, "Come to the haunted house if you dare." Noel and I were very excited about finally finding a haunted house. Cameron, on the other hand, was not impressed. "What's wrong, Cameron? I thought you'd be happy that we finally found one," Noel said. "Why doesn't the flyer say where the haunted house is at?" Cameron asked. We took a closer look at the flyer, and Cameron was right. It didn't say where it was at. It just had a phone number. We debated on whether we should call it or not. It was very suspicious that the flyer didn't just simply state the location where the haunted house was. We eventually decided that I was going to call. The person picked up on the first ring. "Hello? Hey, were you passing out flyers about a haunted house at the mall today?" "Yeah." "I was just wondering if you could tell me where the location of it is. It doesn't say on the flyer." "Oh, my bad. It's at..." "Awesome, thanks. We'll be there." "I'm looking forward to scare you to death." He hangs up the phone before he was able to hear me say what. Noel laughed as I had the phone on speaker, so him and Cameron were able to hear the entire conversation. "I think he was just trying to scare you, dude," Noel said. "I don't know, man. Something about the way he said it was unsettling," says Cameron. It felt like the next few days got more and more ominous the closer to the day of the haunted house it became. Finally, the day came. Cameron picked up Noel and I. We put in the address, and the house was almost an hour away. We didn't think to check out how far it was, way up until the day of the haunted house. "Do you guys still want to go?" asked Cameron. "Of course," said Noel. "I feel like there's no turning back," I said. We eventually found ourselves in a pretty decent looking neighborhood. It was about 5 in the evening. The house itself was rather eye-catching to say the least. It was a pretty big 2-story house. The first thing that grabbed my eye was how it seemed to look. The houses we passed looked like they were built pretty recently. They had bricks and looked like the people took good care of them. The haunted house, on the other hand, was the exact opposite. It was built with wood that looked like it was rotting, and some of the windows were shattered. "Who breaks their windows just for a haunted house?" Cameron said. "They must be really into it," Noel replied. We sat outside of the house, not sure what to do. The lights on the inside were flickering erratically. After about 10 minutes, we decided that we didn't drive an hour for nothing, and we hopped out of the car and headed towards the front door. The stairs to the front porch were also made of wood, and it squeaked every time one of us took a step. We got to the front door and paused. "Remember the flickering lights?" I quietly showed Noel and Cameron one of the windows that wasn't shattered. What was on the other side of the window was a person that sort of seemed like they were floating, but they weren't moving. "Guys, what the fuck is that?" "It's probably a mannequin," Noel said. I shrugged and figured Noel was right, although that mannequin seemed pretty realistic. I tried pressing the doorbell. We didn't hear it go off, so we rung it again. It didn't work the second time, so I pounded on the door. There were some slow and heavy footsteps heading towards the door, but they stopped in front of it. There was silence. The door opened very slowly, creaking very loudly. The person who we were greeted with was tall and on the heavier side. He had a torn pair of jeans and was wearing a stained muscle shirt. I noticed that he had a scar on the left side of his face and a tattoo of a teardrop under his right eye. "Are you guys here for business?" "If that's lingo for the haunted house, then yeah. Where does it start?" I replied. He looks at us confused for a second, but quickly replied with, "Oh, the haunted house. Here, come inside. It starts over here." He pointed to the room that we saw earlier with the mannequin. All three of us went into the room he pointed us to. It smelled rancid. We got a closer look at the mannequin, and it was the most realistic thing I've ever seen. It didn't have any color left, but it just looked like it had real skin on it. Cameron walked up and touched it. We all saw what we were witnessing wasn't a mannequin, but an actual person hanging. Cameron panicked and was trying to pull the corpse off the noose. This only caused the head to separate from the body, and the body split into two. We screamed, but we now had another problem on our hands. The man that was at the door earlier turned off the lights, and it was pitch black. We grabbed our phones to use as flashlights. We saw the man near the front door. "I'm going to make all three of you end up on a noose like that one," he said, enraged. We ran in the opposite direction, trying to find a back door, but for some reason, the house didn't have one. Running in the dark with our flashlights, we head for the stairs. There was a trail of blood on the stairs, but it was the only path that would get us away from that man. We went into the closest room and locked the door. Unfortunately, the only way out at this point was through the window. This was one of the shattered windows that was mentioned earlier. "We gotta jump," I said. "Dude, that glass looks sharp as hell," replied Noel. The man knew where we were at. He started pounding on the door. "I'll go first," Cameron said. Cameron didn't even try to remove the glass. He just went through it, and this caused him to get cut pretty bad. He also didn't properly land and he messed up one of his ankles. I went to jump next, but I made sure to remove the glass as fast as I could, all while this maniac is pounding at the door. The pounding stopped after I cleared the glass and I jumped and landed fine. As Noel was preparing to jump, we heard something very loud. It was a chainsaw, and it was chewing through the door. Noel spared no time and jumped. He landed fine too. Cameron wasn't in the condition to drive, so he passed Noel the keys and told him to drive. The tires screeched as we drove down the neighborhood. We ended up taking Cameron to the hospital, and they gave him a few stitches. They asked us how this happened, and we told them about what had just happened. "Did you call the police?" the nurse asked. "We haven't had the chance to," I replied. "It might be a good idea to," she said in a stern tone. We came to the conclusion that the house we went to was an abandoned house and not a haunted one. We are still flustered about the hanging corpse. There wasn't any blood after it got separated. Did that man drain the blood? I eventually asked Cameron. "Dude, did you think pulling the person on the noose was a good idea?" Noel asked Cameron. "I don't know. In the moment, I thought they might have still been alive," Cameron said. I was mainly concerned with, why did the crazy man want to hang us? Was he trying to start some sort of sick collection of people being hanged? My mom always tried to make sure that my sister Sabrina and I, Jocelyn, had a normal childhood. Our father had died when my sister and I were young from an autoimmune disorder, and we both have only vague memories of him. My mom was sick of staying at home, so she decided to take our Ford Escort and drive to Colorado in the summer of 2020. She told us we were going to the Great Sand Dunes National Park, then to the Rocky Mountain National Park. It took us 2 days to get to the sand dunes from Philadelphia, and we were astonished when we arrived. All the bickering my sister Sabrina and I had done during the car ride paled in comparison to the absolute splendor of the sand dunes. My mom rented sleds, and we actually went sledding down the sand. We spent 4 hours sledding, then we headed towards Salida, Colorado, via Route 17, which was to be around a 3-hour drive. I was the oldest and I helped my mother follow the GPS on her phone, and we had a paper map as a backup. The difference between Philadelphia and Colorado was there weren't as many roads, so if we just stuck on Route 17, then we would be fine. My mother had half a tank of gas, which would have been more than enough to make it to Salida. She always made it a point to stop for gas when we fell below a quarter of a tank, and we figured we would just stop on Route 17 if we needed gas. We headed out on Route 17, and the three of us were joking and having a good time. The radio station that came in played nothing but classic country songs. My mother attempted to sing the words as she drove. We were making good time to Salida until we came upon road construction, where a man pointed to the orange detour sign and we were forced to turn left. As we drove down the road, my mom's phone kept telling us to turn around. Not a big deal, I told my mother. We would just follow the detour signs to get back on Route 17. We must have drove for a half hour, and there were no other detour signs indicating where we were supposed to turn again. Periodically, we would come across unpaved dirt roads marked County Line Road 4, County Line Road 5, that the GPS didn't pick up and didn't show up on our map. We didn't know where those dirt roads would lead us, so we were hesitant to go down one of them. The sun was gradually starting to go down and my mother started to panic. I had never experienced such nothingness. There were no stores, no road signs, just nothing. If you were on this unmarked road, then you lived here, and you knew where you were going. We pulled over as my mother gathered her thoughts. I made the mistake of stopping the GPS. We had zero cell phone service, and we couldn't get back on the GPS. The map we had was useless because the road we were on didn't show up on the map. We discussed our options, and we knew if we turned around, we were screwed because part of Route 17 was probably still closed. If we continued straight, then we didn't know how far the next paved road would be. If we turned right onto the county line dirt roads, then we didn't know if they ran parallel with Route 17, or if they were dead ends. We really didn't have a choice, so we turned right onto County Line Road 8, a dirt road. My mother could barely see what was in front of her because of the dirt and dust. This was truly the most horrifying experience of my lifetime. We started to get low on gas, and nighttime was quickly approaching. My mother had both hands on the steering wheel, and she couldn't drive no faster than 20 miles per hour because of the road conditions. This was the first time she had brought up not feeling safe because we were females, and we were African Americans. We were on this dirt road for a mile, and we came across a house. My mother slowed down, and she didn't see anyone who she could ask for directions. She didn't feel safe getting out of the car, and she was just hoping someone would be out near the road. My mother drove past the house and continued on. My mother really started to become frantic. She didn't know what to do. At this point, we probably wouldn't have made it back to the sand dunes, where there hadn't been a gas station anyway, and if we continued on, we didn't know how far the next gas station could be. My mother continued to drive on the dirt road for 20 minutes, and she came upon a man on a bicycle. She slowed down, and the man on the bike just kept on riding. I'm not sure if he didn't hear us or if he was purposely ignoring us, but he continued to ride his bike. My mother even beeped her horn, and he just wouldn't stop or look over. He eventually turned left into his trailer house, and my mom continued on. I always felt safe with my mother. She was a school teacher who grew up in Philadelphia, and I always thought she could handle anything, but she seemed completely hopeless now. She slowly continued down the dirt road. There was nothing else but farmland marked as potato fields. My mother decided to keep on driving. She drove and drove at only 20 miles per hour. The sun was barely out now. My mother didn't like to drive in the dark because she couldn't see that well. Then she made the tough decision and decided to pull over and stop for the night. She thought it was better to wait for the sun to come back up than continue on this road, versus us potentially running out of gas in the pitch dark with no cell phone service. Both my sister and I pleaded with her to just drive, but she said no. I had my learner's permit, and I offered to drive. However, she was adamant about stopping for the night. We locked our doors, and both my mother and I reclined in the front seat, as Sabrina sat in the back seat complaining about how dark and creepy it was outside. About an hour later, we heard footsteps approach our car. Both my mother and I jumped up in our seats. This man started knocking on the driver's side window. The man didn't say a word, and my mother refused to put her window down. My mother eventually said, "Can I help you?" The man continued to knock, and my mother continued to say, "Can I help you?" My mother then said, "Does this road lead back to Route 17? And the guy didn't answer. He just kept on knocking. I decided to turn the light on my mother's phone and shine the light at him. The man put his arms over his face, like the light was hurting him, and then went away. My mother said, "The fuck was that? What just happened?" She decided that she didn't feel safe, so she turned the car on, and she decided to drive. She drove slowly, and about a mile later, we started seeing people walk along the road. There weren't many houses, so we were perplexed on where these people came from, or where they were going. Eventually, we saw the people turn into a church. My mother decided to turn into the church as well. I commented to my mother that I didn't see a single female. She agreed with me and couldn't think of a reason. We were used to churches welcoming everyone, but we weren't sure about this one. The people seemed upset at my mother's car headlights, so she turned them off. The church was dark. The people walking into the church seemed focused on getting into the church versus acknowledging us. Being that we were females, we weren't sure if we were welcome. But we parked the car and proceeded to walk into the church anyway. The church was lit with candles. The pastor paused briefly as he saw us come in, and then continued with his sermon. He mostly preached about the harvest. The church was filled with about 100 men, where 95% of them were Caucasian and 5% were African American. The mass ended, and my mother told me and my sister to go to the car. My mother waited at the bottom of the church's steps for someone to help her. All the men walked right by her, besides one. I don't know what the two of them were talking about, but my mother started to cry. The man looked into the car at my sister and I from a distance. It looked like the man wanted to leave, but my mother grabbed him by his arm. Eventually, the man left, and my mother planted both of her hands into her forehead and continued to cry. She slowly walked to our car and got in and proceeded to drive away. I asked my mother, "Why were you crying? Did you get the directions?" My mother was speechless as she continued to drive. My sister's son, "Mom, who was that man?" My mother replied, "That man was your father." I sold everything I had to live in this assisted living home called Shady Creek. I settled into my new apartment and it's now lunchtime, so I go down into the dining area. Everyone is sitting together and having a good time. I sit by myself because I don't know anyone and I have no other choice. I try to eat as quickly as possible to avoid this humiliation. I finish and go back to my room. I watch TV for the rest of the night. The next day comes and I sit by myself at breakfast. Once again, I feel humiliated. I look up and I see people laughing. I take it as these people are laughing at me. I finish and go back to my room. I'm now petrified to go to lunch. Eventually, I force myself to walk into the dining area. The employee picks up my lunch slip that I had filled out. She's a high school kid and doesn't care to talk with me. I wait for her to bring me my lunch, and I feel everyone is watching me. I didn't bring a newspaper or anything else, so I can't pretend to be busy. I just sit here by myself as everyone watches me. Eventually, she brings me my lunch and says, "Here you go." Then she walks away. Everyone is sitting at tables of 4 people, 6 people, and even 10, and here I am without a friend. I finish as fast as possible and go back to my room. I don't have money to get food from anywhere else. The food in the dining room is included when I bought into this assisted living facility. I'm too embarrassed to go to dinner. I decide to stay in my room. I wake up and I know I have to go to breakfast. I take the walk of shame to go sit by myself. I have the same high school employee as yesterday who takes my breakfast slip. I doubt she recognized me or remembered me from yesterday. She brings me my breakfast and says, "Here you go." Then she walks away. I can hear people talking about their families, their plans for the day, and current events. I finish and go back to my room. I say to myself that at lunchtime, I have to force myself to go and sit with other people. I build myself up and tell myself I have to do this. I walk to the dining area and see a table where 3 people are sitting. I decide to sit down. None of the 3 people at the table acknowledge me as I go to sit down. The 3 other people awkwardly pause their conversation, then pretend I'm not there. They're not interested in engaging me in conversation. And then a man comes over and says, "Excuse me, partner, you're sitting in my seat." I get up from the table, take the walk of shame again, and sit at a table by myself. I feel completely rejected. I look around and see everyone laughing and having a good time. I haven't talked to anyone in days. No one acknowledges me. The same high school kid takes my lunch slip. I can feel her look at me like I'm pathetic. I feel so rejected that I barely eat and go back to my room. I'm too embarrassed to go to dinner, so I stay in my room. I wake up hungry and decide to forego the embarrassment and stay in my room. I always heard that people can live for days without eating, so I sit in my room and just drink water. I do the same thing for lunch, and then again for dinner. The hunger consumes me as I watch television. I don't even pay attention to what I'm watching. I wake up extremely hungry, and I decide that I have to go to the dining room. As I walk to the vacant table, no one acknowledges me, and I get the drift that no one cares for my presence. The same high school kid doesn't ask where I was yesterday. She just takes my breakfast slip. She plops my plate down, and bite after bite I hear people laughing. I look up and everything seems to be in slow motion. I sense that I'm the butt of many people's laughter. I should have researched this place better. The person who sold me my apartment portrayed a welcoming community. Everything was staged. Once they got my money, my happiness no longer mattered. I went to my room, and today was my weekly LPN visit. She knocks on my door and barely acknowledges me as I let her in. She gives me the same level of conversation as you get when you purchase subway tokens from the person behind the glass room. She takes my vital signs and leaves. I was surprised that she didn't just write down random numbers to fulfill her documentation requirement. I decided to skip lunch, and as dinner approached, I really didn't want to go, and I decided to stay in my room. I get the bare minimal amount of cable channels, and there is really nothing worthwhile to watch. My birthday is tomorrow, and I think of how pathetic it is going to be. I wake up and take a walk to the lobby area, and I see my name mentioned along with 10 other residents regarding October birthdays. Breakfast today is more pathetic than usual. It's my birthday and no one cares. I didn't bother to tell the high school girl. I doubt she would care. I now slip deep into my own consciousness. I look around and see nothing more than demons. Everyone has devil horns, or are demon-like creatures. They shuffle food into their fat faces and mock me as I sit by myself. I finally realized that I bought into the devil's den, and I don't know how to get out. I decide to gather all of my parents' religious paraphernalia that they left me when they died. I will fight fire with fire. I had so much religious paraphernalia on that I looked like the Pope. I went to dinner with my religious attire, and I brought the Bible. As all the devils and ghouls laugh at me while they shuffle food into their grotesque faces. I read the Bible. I don't even acknowledge the teenage girl who picks up my meal slip. I created a moat around me, and no one was going to break through my castle as long as I read the Bible. I made it through the meal. The monsters now had a formidable enemy. I called the local rectory, and they refused to come into this Shady Creek retirement home. I asked the rectory if they make visits into retirement homes, and they said they do, but not Shady Creek. And they refused to give me a reason. Eventually, I fell asleep and got up and went to breakfast in my full religious garb. I walked past the ghouls and they were all whispering to each other and smirking to me as I walked by. The teenage girl is now some short, grotesque creature that resembles a pepperoni pizza. She takes my meal slip and starts to slobber. I bury myself into the Bible. I can't block out the noise in the dining room. All I can hear is laughter and slobbering. I just can't take it anymore. I start reading the Bible out loud, and I can still hear them, so I recite it louder. Eventually I yell out, "Stop it," and they all look at me with evil grins and continue laughing and making slobbering noises. I start yelling out Bible verses, and I'm not going to stop for anything. I finally get these ghouls to stop laughing at me. I continue to yell out, "The Lord is my savior, and evil won't persuade me." Eventually, I see paramedics come in the dining area, and instantaneously the ghouls turn back into their human forms. Everyone is quiet now, and the dining area is resembling a stereotypical retirement home. These ghouls are putting on their best faces in front of the paramedics. The paramedics take me away, and I turn around before I leave, and the ghouls quickly revert back to their ghoulish selves and mockingly wave and grin at me. The paramedics take me to the emergency room to be evaluated by a psychiatrist. I show them a picture on my phone that I took of the ghouls, and they don't believe me and chalk it up to some type of Halloween event. I'm allowed to leave the emergency room on my own accord, and I decide to go to a shelter rather than go back to Shady Creek. The first time I saw him, I was 6 years old. At least, that's what my memory tells me. Whether or not it's trustworthy is an entirely different matter. Back then, my sister and I shared bunk beds, her on the bottom and me on the top. Out of habit, I'd always slept facing the wall. That way, if any monsters appeared, I would be none the wiser. Most likely this way down to my overreactive imagination. I had an irrational fear of a werewolf breaking into my house after all. Or maybe, just maybe, I was right. My grandfather grew sick after my birthday. Lung cancer was the diagnosis, and it was aggressive, resisting every kind of haphazard treatment the doctors threw at it. By January, they'd declared him terminally ill and he was refined to his hospital bed. My visits were weekly and awfully short. I suppose he couldn't breathe without the ventilator for much longer than 15 minutes, but my younger self wasn't aware of this. I can recall multiple occasions where I had to be dragged from the room kicking and screaming. How do you explain death to a child? The very thought of existing and then, as quick as lightning, ceasing to exist. It was terrifying to me. Perhaps naively, my parents thought that if they kept the inevitable from me, I wouldn't notice him fading away. They were wrong. Even if I wasn't quite sure of what was happening, I had a feeling that something was wrong. Very wrong. I was never the religious sort as a child, but I diligently attended Sunday school to please my Christian grandmother. Something was wrong. I was sure of it. And so I did what any half God-believing and certainly God-fearing child would do. For the first time, I prayed. I prayed during school assemblies, before I went to sleep, at the dinner table. Each place I went, I prayed. Despite my efforts, I never expected to receive an answer. But an answer was what I got. The manifestation was slow at first. Teasing, but it was there. And the voice whispering to me in my sleep, sounding as if it were slithering through the walls, sending me secret messages in the pages we read at junior Bible study. I was imaginative, yes, but I wasn't crazy. I'm not crazy. The first time I saw him, I wasn't quite sure what to make of it. He wasn't what I'd expected, but then, what had I been expecting? It was a cold night during the height of winter, but other than that, one like any other. I lay in bed, fast asleep and swaddled like a baby in my blankets. My mind was blank, empty of dreams. It was then that I heard the footsteps, muffled at first but growing louder by the second until I could have sworn they were right next to me. The noise cast me out of my slumber. I lay in silence, groggy from tiredness, waiting for my eyes to adjust. When they finally did, I almost didn't see him. He stood concealed by the shadows in the corner of my bedroom. Non-corporeal, but certainly real. Yes, definitely real. Looking back on it now, I have the strange urge to laugh at the absurdity of it all. Here he was, tall and faceless aside from a pair of bright amber eyes. At the very least, he seemed out of place standing next to one of those crappy wall-mounted TVs pretty much every early 2000s kid owned. I expected to be arrested by panic, but his presence was oddly calming. Silence reigned for what felt like hours until he approached my bed. With swift, not really steps, our eyes met. "It is done," he said. I blinked. His voice sounded like two voices, three voices, millions of voices talking at all once. Its timbre was rich and impossibly soothing. He left. I slept. And that, I thought, would be the end of it. It wouldn't be the first time I was wrong. The next morning saw two rather remarkable things happen. Firstly, I was quite sure I'd met God, or an angel at the very least. I spent the entire day at school telling anyone who would listen that praying did work, and that God had chosen me, not any of them. Although I was tempted to tell them this, to visit. The ensuing sense of superiority was hard to shake off. The second was, I believed, nothing short of a miracle. My father, misty-eyed and smiling, came to pick me up from school. My parents sat me down on the sofa, each slinging an arm around my shoulders, and telling me that my grandfather was getting better. The cancer was retreating. The drugs had finally worked. He was back home in a matter of weeks, after rigorous testing. "It's a miracle," various members of my family said, over and over until it became some sort of mantra. There was no real meaning, though, behind the phrase. It angered me. I knew for certain that it had been a miracle, because I had prayed for it, and God had performed it. My prayers turned to praise, to thank yous whispered into the darkness. My faith was confirmed. All I could do was hope that God would visit me again. He didn't. Or, at least, not until the need arose. That wouldn't be for years. At 14, my best friend's older sister was hospitalized. I'd known her ever since I started going to church. Grace sobbed to me over the phone for hours, telling me how the driver who had hit her car had been drunk beyond belief. She'd nearly bled out on the scene. Grace wished for a miracle. I, remembering my grandfather's recovery, went one step further. I prayed for it. Days passed and I refused to let go of hope. Grace was in hysterics. Her family was deciding whether or not to switch off the life support that kept Alicia breathing. Severe brain damage, 3 broken ribs, a broken spine. It couldn't be done, the doctors said. There was no way she'd survive. I remained confident. They'd said exactly the same before. The second time he appeared, I hadn't even been to sleep. I'd been staring ahead of me at a wall, twisting and turning and praying as I always did. Grace hadn't texted me in over an hour. I feared for the worst. And then he was there, exactly as he was before, and it was just so magnificent that I had to grin. "It is done," he said, just as he had done years ago. I thought his voice might have been different, more strangled perhaps. I let it be, watching him leave and wishing he would stay. "Thank you, God," I cried the next morning, rushing to call Grace. Alicia had woken in the middle of the night, frightened and scarcely breathing, but alive. Alive. Hallelujah. My mind screamed as I ran downstairs, grabbing my coat and shouting a hasty goodbye to my parents. There was no response. By the time I returned, it was late afternoon. My eyelids were drooping, but the tiredness seeping into my very bones did little to deter me from going to my room and giving my thanks to God. I felt more powerful than I'd ever felt in my entire life. Nothing could take away my happiness now, I thought. I thought, as I often do, wrong. That night, in the bed underneath mine, my sister died. It was a seizure, grand mal, sudden onset, apparently torturous to experience. I hadn't even felt the bed move. For some time I was angry with God, furious, in fact. Surely I'd been selfless in my prayers for Alicia. He'd saved her. Why couldn't he save Daisy? I didn't pray for 3 weeks, not until the funeral. My sister was the family darling, and whilst my distant relatives and friends were kind enough, or as kind as patronizing, grief-minimizing, head-petting adults can be, there was a glint in their eyes as they watched me. I hated it. I knew what it meant. Somewhere, deep down, they wished it had been me who had died. The wake was no better than the service itself, and I found myself in the bathroom crying, completely alone. Until I wasn't alone, because I began to pray. I prayed that God would stay with me, that he would forgive me for my blasphemy. He did. From then on, from the very first time I saw those amber eyes reflected behind me in the mirror, he stayed. He never left. I was foolish. It was always there, slithering within me rather than in the walls, begging for my attention. I kept praying to God, giving him my thanks, feeding him with all the love and affection I could muster. I prayed for my teacher's son who was addicted to drugs. My cousin died of an unexpected overdose. He never even drunk alcohol before. I prayed for a father's friend who was suffering from meningitis. Not a week later, my grandmother passed away with it. I prayed for everyone I could until my prayers stopped working. I prayed until my life was overtaken by grief and the smell of death, and I was drowning whilst fully alive. My parents died. My aunts and uncles died. Even those patronizing relatives I admittedly hated eventually died. I was the only one left. God wasn't a him anymore. God wasn't it. Then, I lost everyone. God wasn't God anymore, and I knew it. God had never been the real God. My last prayer was to join them, to be reunited with them in death. Heaven was something I didn't dare to hope for. Ironically, my prayers didn't work. As I write this, I'm in my flat. I think I'm alone. I'm checking the mirror, the wardrobe, the kitchen cabinets, pressing my ear to the wall in case I hear that awful noise. Nothing. It's been 3 years exactly since I last saw the shadow. It's been 3 years since I felt anything. Sometimes I wish I had a roommate, but I suppose having one all these years did me far more harm than good. Maybe there is a God somewhere. I don't dare to think about it very much. I sit in silence and I stare at the walls. I lie in my bed with my back to the door. So I'm in this apartment I love, and my roommates and I have always had no odd activity here. Well, I got a fiance, and my fiance is very in touch with what others call the supernatural. This will matter later. So he moved in and tension started. My roommates and I are no longer really friends, and some things started happening in the Discord. You know, first like, I swear I turned off that light, or I closed the door and now it's open. My fiance, N, said he felt like it was a small girl who was mischievous and funny dubbed Junior. So yeah, small things like that. So one night my roommate's best friend was over, and they were watching a movie and suddenly my roommate's light turned off. My roommate's friend, let's call him M, ran into my room and asked if I had turned off the light. I said no. And M actually believes in what I and N believe. So we all began talking and roommate, C, began talking smack about Junior, and his light flicked on and off again. We were all like, you better stop. And C just rolled his eyes. Well, M went home and N and I went to bed. In the morning, I come out and C is on the couch sleeping. I asked him what the fuck he's doing on the couch, and he replied that he didn't feel safe in his room. I was like, well, you shouldn't have provoked her. He still doesn't believe, and I don't really care because I respect her. And she does cute little things a lot, like opening my closet door repeatedly and opening the bathroom door when N is in there. There are small things here and there, but every time C starts in our belief by being sarcastic, something happens to him. Anyway, I know it's not super scary, but I don't disrespect things that are trying to be peaceful.